Brace yourself for this next story because Pakistan is talking about peace. It's one of the most absurd stories of the week. Maybe a tie with this human/bear in China. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif wants talks with India. Listen to this first.
We are prepared to talk to them, provided that the neighbor is serious to talk serious matters on the table. Because war is no more an option, that our neighbor has to understand that we cannot become normal neighbors unless abnormalities are removed, unless our serious issues are understood and addressed to through peaceful and meaningful discussions.
Classic Pakistan. Talk about war and peace in the same sentence. Just one advice for Shehbaz Sharif though. Next time, maybe mention who you're talking about. It's India, not neighbor. Now, there are two things which stand out in Shehbaz Sharif's statement. One, he's accusing India of not being serious. You heard his words. We are willing to talk provided the neighbor is serious. That's what he said. And two, he talks about abnormalities. Shehbaz Sharif says abnormalities must be removed if relations are to be normal. Good wordplay, but beyond that, what are these abnormalities? That Shehbaz Sharif did not specify. For India, it's always been terrorism. India has insisted that terror and talks cannot go hand in hand. We'll have to wait and see the response this time. But Shehbaz Sharif's comments were not isolated. Elsewhere, his Minister of State for Foreign Affairs was also talking about India. Her name is Hina Rabbani Khar, and her tone was quite different. Listen to this.
Then there is the East, okay, which is the darling of the West, but really has decided to be the darling of the West while at the same time being very, very belligerent within the East. So India, stands out as a country which is very, very open towards certain countries, but very, very closed-minded towards some of its own people and towards certain countries within the region.
Hina Rabbani Khar says India is trying to be the darling of the West. Maybe that's why India is the top buyer of Russian oil. Or why India criticizes Western comments on internal issues, or why India attends the SCO and BRICS summits. Plus, it's a bit rich coming from Pakistan. This is a country that spent most of the Cold War years doing America's dirty work. So less of a darling, more of a minion. Anyway, let's focus on what they're trying to do here. The Pakistani leaders. Sharif, at least on paper, is the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Any initiative aimed at peace is welcome, especially coming from Islamabad. But when Pakistan talks about peace, you must ask three questions. A, why now? B, do their actions match it? And C, does the army support it? The timing is indeed strange. Shehbaz Sharif is an outgoing Prime Minister. Why would he make a peace appeal to India? Normally, it is done to appease international lenders and Western countries. When Pakistan needs a bailout, they talk sweet. They pretend to be the nice guys. So could this be a similar attempt? The International Monetary Fund has released one payment for Pakistan, but reports say they're going to need more. Comments about peace and talks are usually green lights for lenders. They signal positivity. And there is precedent for Pakistan doing this. On the 17th of January this year, Shehbaz Sharif made a similar appeal. He offered talks with India. And guess what happened after 2 weeks? Pakistan held the first round of their talks with the IMF. So that's definitely a possibility. Now to the second question. What is Pakistan doing for this peace that they want? Well, pretty much nothing. Reports say border infiltrations are still happening. So is smuggling of narcotics. You see, there's a big difference between talking peace and working for peace. Pakistan only does the first. They talk. Finally, question number 3. Does the army approve of Shehbaz Sharif's statements? I would think so, because the army chief, Asim Munir, was present at the same event. Those comments by Shehbaz Sharif were made in his presence, the army chief's presence. Plus, the current government is supposed to be supported by the army. So I'm guessing they do agree. If you keep all the history aside, if you look at the pure logic of this appeal, it makes perfect sense. Pakistan desperately needs India's friendship. Their inflation is still at 28%. Their external debt is still unpaid. Around 8 million Pakistanis are likely to experience acute food shortage this season. And to top it all, the security situation is bad. Just this week, there was a suicide attack at a political rally. Around 56 people died. So on paper, Pakistan needs normal relations with India, very much. The so-called darling of the West could really help them out. Just look at Sri Lanka. India lobbied for Colombo at the IMF. Lenders from Japan and France are now lining up to help. Pakistan could have used that help from India. But unfortunately, you can't keep the history aside. In Pakistan, decisions are taken in the army's interest, not the people. So unless you see concrete actions to back up peace offers, you can never be sure. Nonetheless, this is an offer, and we'll have to wait and see how India responds. America has been downgraded, and that's our lead story tonight. The US, as you would know, dominates the global financial world. Financial managers want to invest in America. A US government bond is considered as safe as gold. And the dollar, for all the pushback it faces, remains the world's default currency. But America's dominant position is now under stress. A leading credit rating agency has downgraded the US. The name of the agency is Fitch. It assesses creditworthiness of countries, and it believes that the US is not as trustworthy as it used to be. So today they announced a downgrade, and the White House is pushing back. They've issued aggressive statements to counter the downgrade. This is, at best, damage control. We'll tell you why, but first the details of the downgrade. What does it even mean? What is a downgrade? Let me explain. Do you remember your grade card in school, your report card? It was an assessment of how you performed in different subjects. There were grades from A to F. A means you've aced it, F means you've failed. It's quite simple. And that's exactly how the Fitch rating works. It is a report card, but for governments. And what does it assess? Their financial health. Investors and lenders rely on these ratings. They use the rating to assess if they should buy a certain government bond. The rating helps them decide whether or not they should stay invested in a country. And this is the rating we're talking about tonight. Let's look at the Fitch report card. Earlier, America was rated AAA, AAA, the highest. The US was the school topper, the best in class, one of the safest places to keep your money. Now, it has been pushed one level down from AAA to AA+. How bad is that? Well, technically speaking, not very bad, just a notch down in the pecking order. But along with the rating, Fitch has also shared an analysis, and it merits a closer look. Fitch says this downgrade does not happen overnight. America's position has been gradually deteriorating. And broadly, there are three problems: erosion of governance, rising government deficit, and high levels of debt. In fact, debt is what Fitch is the most worried about. America's national debt stands at more than $30 trillion. It is the highest in the world, $30 trillion. And the US struggles to manage it. And on that front, Fitch has issued a scathing indictment. In fact, let me quote from that report. In Fitch's view, there has been a steady deterioration in standards of governance over the last 20 years. The repeated debt limit, political standoffs, and last-minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management. There is a clear takeaway from this. Fitch has lost trust in America. It doesn't think that the US is the best anymore. And that's not sitting well with Washington. The Biden administration has come down hard on Fitch. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the Fitch downgrade is quote-unquote arbitrary, and that it's based on outdated data. That's the term she used. Yellen said she strongly disagrees with Fitch. And the White House has said the same thing. Larry Summers has also weighed in. Larry Summers served as the Treasury Secretary during the Clinton years, and he says the Fitch decision is quote-unquote bizarre and inept. Then we have statements from some leading economists. They've used words like strange and puzzled. But if you look closely, it is not strange at all. America owes more than $32 trillion. That is a real number. It's not an estimate. And every few years, this debt leads to a political standoff. You see, the US has something called the debt ceiling. That's a concept that they have. The government cannot borrow beyond a certain limit. So when it is about to run out of cash, it tries to raise the limit, or the debt ceiling, as they call it. Lawmakers from both sides have to come together then. They have to pass a bill. To keep the government running, they must pass this bill. And this often leads to an impasse. In some cases, even a total shutdown of government. Since the 1970s, there have been a total of 21 shutdowns, 21 government shutdowns in the US. This year, they almost defaulted on their debts, the US government. The Biden administration wanted to borrow money, but the Republicans were not on board. It went down to the wire. They waited till the very last minute to pass the new budget and raise the borrowing limit. So the US narrowly avoided a default. There was no shutdown, but the uncertainty spooked the financial world. This Fitch report conveys the same reality. So instead of complaining, perhaps the US should set its house in order. Now let's talk about another Southeast Asian country, Singapore, where the bottom line is, well, the bottom line. Back in 2007, the government made a major announcement. It had hiked the salaries of its ministers, not by 20 or 30%, but by 60%. An increment of anyone's dreams, really, 60% hike. The Prime Minister saw his pay jump to over $2 million. It was 5 times what then US President George Bush was making. Why was Singapore so generous with its ministers' salaries? Well, there is no hidden or evil reason here, hopefully. They simply wanted to pay the lawmakers well, to ensure that they were happy, to deter corruption, and to keep the politics clean. Today, Singaporean lawmakers are among the best paid in the world. Their salaries are comparable to top earners in the private sector. But here's the thing. When the government pays its leaders well, it also demands accountability. It always should, but in this case particularly. And a clear example of this is before our eyes. Meet S. Iswaran, the Transport Minister of Singapore. He was arrested last month in relation to a corruption investigation. Incidents of corruption are rare in Singapore, at least reportedly and until recently. Singaporean lawmakers are known to stand on high moral ground. And with Iswaran's corruption scandal too, the parliament refuses to lower its pedestal. An investigation is still underway, but Iswaran is already facing the music. His pay has been cut by 82%. You heard that right. A cabinet minister under investigation has got a pay cut, and that too by more than 80%, 80. It's almost unbelievable. How many times do you hear that? Not enough, I would say. Reports say this has happened only twice in the past, both times in Japan. In 2021, 5 officials in Japan's communication ministry received pay cuts. What for? For whining and dining. They enjoyed expensive meals sponsored by the companies they worked with. In 2018, Japan's then finance minister, Taro Aso, took a pay cut. It was voluntary. He let go of his salary for 1 year because 20 of his officials tampered with public documents. Can you believe it? The finance minister of a country taking 1 year's salary cut, taking responsibility for his team's actions. Sounds almost dystopian. That is not to say that ministers do not take pay cuts. Of course they do. All across the world on several occasions. I'll give you some examples. This year, Mozambique reduced the pay of its senior officials to reduce its salary bill. Last year, Malaysian ministers took a 20% pay cut. This was to show solidarity as their country suffered economic troubles. During the pandemic in 2020, both Indian and Kiwi ministers took a pay cut, which is all very well, but more often than not, these moves fail to impress people because leaders across the world have been involved in corruption charges. Take, for instance, Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan. He has more than 100 cases of corruption against him. Whatever the talk of political vendetta, there is proof of corruption against Imran Khan. He faces the law. Here in India, scores of leaders have corruption cases. What action do they face? How often is justice served? Forget punishment. Do they even get a pay cut? And that is not enough punishment for a corrupt lawmaker. But it makes a significant point. Lawmakers say they serve their country and their people. Do they face action when they don't do their job well? Do they get an incentive when they do it better? In a world where all of us are assessed on the basis of performance, I think it's time we demand better accountability and more transparency from lawmakers. Singapore's example is an interesting one. What do you think? Do you think salary cut should be punishment for a minister who doesn't deliver or is under investigation? Write to us with your thoughts. Our next story is about work from home, the modern work conundrum. It has divided people like few things can. There's a bunch of people who like their comfort and freedom and want to continue working from home. And there's another set that says remote work compromises productivity and teamwork. Is it just a war of preferences, or does data support one case over another? And that debate is very much on. In countries like Australia, it has turned into a lightning rod. Australians are so mad about returning to office, they're taking companies to court. They want the right to work from home forever. Here's a report.
The worst of the pandemic is over. People are back to living their normal lives. But what exactly is the new normal? Is it working from home? Is it working from office? Is it a bit of both? That's up for a debate. And it's turning out to be quite a contest. Elon Musk may call for an end to work from home, but it's unlikely he will succeed in Australia. Australians have the world's strongest work from home rights. In fact, they hate working from office so much that they're taking companies to court over it. Unions in Australia are setting a precedent. They are fighting tooth and nail with companies, with banks, and even with the federal government, all for one reason. They want work from home to become the norm. In April, the CEO of National Australia Bank ordered 500 senior managers to ditch work from home. They were asked to come back to the office full-time. Now, this is Australia's third largest bank, but the public sector union fought back. They challenged the directive. In July, the bank had to give in. It agreed to a union deal that gives all employees the right to request work from home. The same week, the union struck another deal. It now lets Australia's 120,000 federal employees request work from home for an unlimited number of days. So, Australia may sound like work from home heaven, and it is. But is this the picture across the globe? Employees may like working in their pajamas, but companies want them back on their desk. A survey asked 35,000 workers and employers in 34 countries. Only 19% of the workers wanted to return to the office. They wanted 2 days of work from home every week. Meanwhile, the bosses wanted just one. Does this mean the era of work from home is over? Companies were hoping that it would be once they issued mandates. But they are clearly wrong, like what happened in Australia. So the end of that debate is on the horizon. There's a clear gap between what workers want and what companies think is good for them. This sets the stage for a historic confrontation, one that could drag on forever. So is the inevitable a compromise, a hybrid work model? Most probably, yes.
Our next story comes from China and Japan. Two storms are wreaking havoc in these countries. Beijing is battling the fallout of Typhoon Doksuri, and Japan is facing off against Typhoon Khanun. Beijing is partially submerged in water and mud. The Chinese capital has recorded its heaviest rains in 140 years, 140 years, which means it's the heaviest rainfall in Beijing since records began. Meanwhile, Japan's Okinawa island was battered by strong winds, heavy rain and destructive waves. More than a third of the island is without electricity, and it may take a while for things to improve. Here's more.
The rain seemed to have relented in Beijing, at least a little. That's because Typhoon Doksuri is moving on. But it left almost every part of Beijing submerged. These are visuals from one of the airports in the city. The runways were underwater and the flights were grounded. What you're looking at now is being called a graveyard of cars, all swept up and destroyed by the storm. Most of Beijing has been left with streets full of water, mud, and trash. This is a wetland park in the city. The water levels have reached the treetops there, and the park has become home to a floating pile of garbage. Doksuri caused tremendous destruction. It will take a while to clean up. After being battered for 4 days and 4 nights, the Chinese capital seems to have gotten a break. But those 4 days took their toll. At least 11 people have died in Beijing, and some are still missing. Chinese paramilitary forces have been involved in the search and rescue. They've been taking out inflatable rafts to navigate through the roads that have turned into rivers, risking their lives to try and save Beijing's stranded residents. Reports say 2 of the 11 casualties in the city were rescue workers. They've also been delivering food and supplies via helicopter to residents trapped in their homes. The storm may be leaving Beijing, but it's heading further inland. Hundreds of thousands have been evacuated from cities in the neighbouring Hebei province. That's where Typhoon Doksuri is headed. The typhoon broke numerous records in Beijing. The city saw its worst rainfall since records began 140 years ago. Since Saturday, it has received 744.8 millimeters of rainfall. It was worse than even the storm of 2012. That was when Beijing last saw similar amounts of rain. Just 40 hours after the rains began, Beijing received the average rainfall for the entire month of July. A month's worth of rainfall hit China's capital in less than 2 days, which explains why the city is in disarray. Now that the typhoon has gone, Beijing has some breathing space to work on rescue and recovery. But in nearby Japan, the chaos is just beginning. Typhoon Khanun is wreaking havoc there. Khanun means jackfruit in Thai, but the sweet-sounding name takes nothing away from its fury. It has just passed the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is located in the far south of Japan, and this is the state of the island. Cars have been tossed aside by Typhoon Khanun's strong winds. The winds uprooted trees in the island as well. They led to huge waves crashing down on Okinawa's shores. And the typhoon also led to a massive power outage. More than a third of the island's houses were without power. About 200,000 people were affected. All flights from the island's airport were suspended, leaving residents and visitors at the mercy of the typhoon. The typhoon is moving west towards China at the moment, but it is expected to return. Come Friday, Typhoon Khanun is expected to turn towards Okinawa again, and once again drench the island. So the island is bracing itself for a tough week. One thing is certain, none of this is normal. These extreme weather events are the result of human-induced climate change. We are making things worse. How long till we accept that our constant greenhouse gas emissions are harming us in the long run? How long before we work earnestly towards fixing our mess?
And finally, it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story, starting with Jerusalem. The August full moon, also called the supermoon, rose above the old city. It was the first of the 2 supermoons to be witnessed this month. In Sri Lanka, an uninvited guest appeared during a Lanka Premier League match. Players were as shocked as the spectators. We'll introduce you to the guest. Meanwhile, in China, the video of a bear is doing the rounds. It shows the bear standing on its hind legs inside a zoo enclosure. The video has sparked a debate. Is it really a bear or a man in a bear costume? That's the burning question in China right now. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1990, Iraq invaded its small but oil-rich neighbor Kuwait. It took only a few hours to capture Kuwait City. The Emir of Kuwait fled to Saudi Arabia. Iraq not only gained control of 20% of the world's oil reserves, but also a substantial coastline on the Persian Gulf. We're leaving you with that. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from Gandhinagar.
One thing that cricket field, I think we've got to wait for him to just exit. I don't know.
Looks like massive one. Who's the 4th umpire? He's a brave guy. Looks like it's. That must be a first. This type of a holder.
This is serious business.
Nervous now. Which kid bag? Qua đây.